Today is Palm Sunday, which is of course the first day of Holy Week, that week in which we see the great outpouring of God's love for us through the arrest, the crucifixion and the death of our Lord Jesus Christ. And I want us to think this week upon how we respond to that love of God. And I want first of all for us to think about how we recognise God's presence in our lives. Many years ago I had the great pleasure of meeting the Reverend Robert Llewellyn, who had been the chaplain at the Church of St. Julian's in Norwich. And he spoke of how the love of God shines upon us as the sun shines upon us each day. And even though the sun shines, it is within our power to close the curtains, to shutter the blinds, even to put on a blindfold. It's within our power to deny the presence of God, to shut ourselves from it. And many, many people do that, and yet at the same time then complain that they are in the dark. They shut themselves off from God and then complain that they have no knowledge of God. But the more that we can be open to God, the more available we are to Him, then the greater we will sense His presence and His work within us. So firstly, let us be open to God. Secondly, we need to be available to God. One of the great parables that Jesus speaks is that of the wedding feast, of how God calls people to come and celebrate and to rejoice with Him. And yet when His servants go and meet the guests and invite them, they all of them have more pressing issues. They all of them have other things that they think they could and should be doing. And so eventually none of them respond to His call. All of them are too busy. None of them are available to God. But one of the things that we notice in the life of Jesus is that He lived an itinerant life. He wasn't tied down by the things of this world, and by not being tied down, He made Himself available to God, to serve His ministry and His mission, to serve God's people in what He said throughout the whole of Galilee and Judea, through what He did in feeding the hungry, in healing the sick, in raising the dead. And of course, most appropriately and most importantly, through His sacrifice on the cross for the sake of God's people. That then leads us on to the third response, to be active in God's service. And no one ever got to be good at anything without practice. As many of you will know, I like to go fishing. And before I first ever cast a line, I went on YouTube, I read books about it, I watched videos. But nothing in those books and videos prepares you for when you cast your hook into a reed bed, when it catches on the trees behind your back, when you make any number of stupid mistakes. Mistakes that over time and with practice we get ironed out. We learn from our mistakes and we get better. But more than that, through practice we also train our bodies. We develop what is called muscle memory, so that our bodies can act and react with very little positive and active thought. We attune ourselves. And so it is with the ministry of God. Through practice we become used to working in different situations. We get used to serving Him without having to think long and hard about it, and we find ourselves refreshed through service rather than being tired by it. And the final thing that we need to do is to communicate with God. Even Jesus, whose life was so finely attuned to his ministry, who lived in such a unique relationship with God, found it necessary to go off into the hills, to go off into the wilderness and find time alone and find time to pray. It is through communications that relationships grow and develop and flourish, and that's no different in our relationship with God. Unfortunately, we tend to be a bit standoffish with God. We either treat God as a servant to be called upon when we need him, or we think that God is too busy and too active in other spheres to be concerned with us. And both these extremes miss out the point. The point that one of the names of Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. One of the opportunities that we've been given over these weeks of isolation is to find means of worship and means of prayer outside of public worship, outside of the gathering of the church community, to grow and develop our own personal relationship with God. And that's one of the things that I would encourage us all to do today. I began this morning by asking how we can respond to that great love of God shown to us in Jesus Christ. And I've given us 4 possible responses. First of all, to be open to God. Secondly, to be available to God. Thirdly, to be active in God. And finally, to communicate with God. I hope that we can all take this time of Holy Week to grow in these responses, to grow as Christian people, to grow in our relationship with God, and to think how, when all this is over and we take up our normal lives again, how we might be greater servants of God in our homes, amongst our families, in our communities, amongst our neighbours, and as part of the worldwide fellowship of Christ. I wish you all a very blessed and joyful Holy Week.